The Catcher in the Rye follows Holden Caulfield's failed attempts at human connection and romanticized view on childhood. Initially published in 1951, the coming-of-age tale is set in New York City in the late 1940s. It is the story of a teenager and his dramatic refusal to mature. Narrated by its protagonist, the novel follows Holden Caulfield's fourth expulsion from an elite preparatory school as he recounts it from a hospital bed. He decides to leave school early and spend a few days exploring New York City before he goes home. Most of the book follows Holden Caulfield's attempts to connect with others before his self-protective disgust with the world destroys any connection. When he is able to interact with adults, he purges before retreating into isolation. Though he rejects the adult world as phony, his encounters fail because he is unable to act maturely when he does want to reach out, making inappropriate decisions until the other becomes annoyed or angry. The story's climax culminates in Holden's visit to his younger sister Phoebe. Phoebe confronts Holden, angry that he has once again been expelled. Holden responds by telling his sister about his lifelong dream, for which the novel owes its namesake. He dreams of being the Catcher in the Rye, after Robert Burns' poem he once read, someone who catches children before they fall off the edge of an imaginary cliff. Phoebe explains that he has misremembered the poem, causing Holden to question his entire interpretation of adulthood, and therefore his belief system. Holden decides to run away, but the plan quickly collapses when Phoebe insists on joining him. In the final scene, Holden watches as Phoebe rides a carousel, and along with all the other children, attempts to grab an unreachable golden ring. Through Phoebe's innocence, Holden no longer feels threatened by his looming adulthood and is finally at peace. Holden Caulfield is an unreliable narrator, and there can be no denying it. He is judgmental to the point of frustration, criticizing and looking for flaws in everyone around him. Holden describes himself as trapped on the other side of life, trying desperately to find his place in the world he's isolated from. Holden maintains a cynical air of superiority to protect himself and distance himself. He is an unusual protagonist for a coming-of-age story because he resists maturity and growing up. The novel centers around the loss of innocence and alienation as a method of self-preservation. The Catcher in the Rye provides an intimate glimpse into one of America's most reclusive writers, JD Salinger. Undeniably autobiographical, it is a deeper reflection of Salinger's youth, his complicated relation with growing up, and the generational trauma affected by World War II. Salinger drew on his personal experiences fighting in the war and his New York upbringing to pen the character of Holden Caulfield. He was born in Manhattan and led a childhood much like Caulfield's. It was while he was enrolled at military school that Salinger began to write, under the covers with the aid of a flashlight. Salinger was described as a mediocre student, much like the failing Caulfield. After graduation, he attended New York University and Columbia, never graduating from either. It was at Columbia, however, that Salinger met his future mentor and the editor of Story magazine, Whit Burnett. Salinger began to submit his short stories to the New Yorker for publication consideration. After 7 rejections, they accepted Slight Rebellion off Madison in December of 1941. The story took place in Manhattan and was the first to feature Holden Caulfield, an apathetic teenager with pre-war jitters. Unfortunately, following the attack on Pearl Harbor shortly after, the story was determined unpublishable, crushing Salinger. It was eventually published after the war in 1946. JD Salinger was drafted into the American Army in 1942 and fought in some of the most influential battles of the war. In an infamous cruel twist of fate, JD Salinger began his military career on D-Day, storming the beaches of Normandy with Slight Rebellion off Madison in his pocket. It was during the war that Salinger wrote most of his short stories, featuring Holden Caulfield. Due to his proficiency in English, French, and German, Salinger worked in the counterintelligence unit where he interrogated prisoners of war. While on his first campaign from Normandy to Germany, Salinger met fellow writer and longtime inspiration Ernest Hemingway. He participated in the liberation of the Kaufering 4 concentration camp. Shortly after the defeat of Germany, Salinger was hospitalized for combat stress reaction. His experience in the war and psychiatric hospitals is present throughout his writing. In their correspondence, Salinger told Hemingway about a play he was working on and his dream to play the lead part himself, Holden Caulfield. Salinger's former lover, Joyce Maynard, explained, "The only person who might have ever played Holden Caulfield would have been J.D. Salinger." In a 1953 review, Salinger called the novel slightly autobiographical, saying, "My boyhood was very much the same as that of the boy in the book. It was a great relief telling people about it." After the release of The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger published a few more stories before hiding away and becoming reclusive. On October 23, 1992, the New York Times reported that not even a fire that consumed at least half of his home on Tuesday could smoke out the reclusive JD Salinger. Mr. Salinger is almost equally famous for having elevated privacy to an art form. He would eventually deny any similarities between himself and Holden as the press fought to invade his personal and private life. The Catcher in the Rye became an instant sensation, met with equal commendation and controversy. Within 2 months of its initial release, The Catcher in the Rye had been reprinted 8 times. It became the handbook for teenage aloofness. Reactions ranged from praise for Salinger's unusually brilliant first novel to criticism for the book's open allowance of prostitution and swearing. With a fan base nicknamed the Catcher Cult, the novel was banned in multiple countries because of its subject matter. High school teachers who assigned the book were forced to resign or quit. It is the most frequently banned novel across the United States, while simultaneously being the second most frequently assigned. Despite censorship, no other character has been identified within Western literature as Holden Caulfield has. 50 years after its initial publication, the New Yorker said that The Catcher in the Rye rewrites itself every generation, defining its own literary genre. Despite the growing animosity between age groups and the ever-present tension between parents and their teenagers, grandparents and their grandchildren, Salinger captured a universal and timeless experience within the pages of The Catcher in the Rye. There is comfort in intergenerational connections and the teenage identity that is shared with them. Through his regretfully honest novel, JD Salinger created a piece of media that is eternally relatable. Any literature that can bridge gaps and unite divided groups must be celebrated.